Southeast Asia Part 2. So we're cruising along, jumping actually too fast now. So before we start Southeast Asia Part 2 and we get into that globalization and development like usual, I'm going to just talk about European colonialization because it's kind of important. When we talk about the human patterns over time, we usually skip over this part. It's actually great historical context that I encourage all of you to actually check out, but in the nature of this not being a history class, like some of us may think, that it's actually going to be a geography class, so we're going to focus more on the things that are taking place there now, though we do a lot of history. But this is kind of a clunky image, although is what it is, pulled it down without making my own. But it's important for understanding historical context, much happening before. And so here we have in the blue here, it's number one. I don't know why we need both of these really. Whoever did this really didn't think we could handle this graphic because we got colors and we got numbers, whatever. So we have France at one point controlling Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The British, the United Kingdom, once having Burma, Malaysia, at one point Brunei and Singapore were part of this as well. Indonesia were the Portuguese, and also East Timor. And the Philippines were the Spanish, and then the Americans, actually. Fun fact, after the Spanish-American War. And so a few places. And now why is this dark? Well, Siam, used to be called Siam, now Thailand, and never colonized by the Europeans, and so they were kind of quite proud of that. But nevertheless, if you recall your Vietnam War era geography, or just sort of previous notation of it, this used to be called French Indochina, because we know this is the Indochina Peninsula, French Indochina, because they did control these three these three countries, Thailand or Siam not being colonized, and then obviously off here the British, but nevertheless French Indochina, Indonesia, and what have you. So this may help us contextualize things, at least historically speaking, before we get into globalization and development like usual. So now we talk about economics, and let's have fun with that. It's the idea of state-aided markets and export-led economic development. It shouldn't be too difficult for you to recall that we just talked about this in South and East Asia. State-aided markets, like we talked about in Japan, in South Korea, and Taiwan. And we talked about these economies juxtaposed with communist economies like North Korea, China, and Mongolia. And there were differences. And we know that the communist economies didn't do so well, largely speaking. Although China's a different story, although we have a whole debate what kind of economy it really is. Nevertheless, with state-aided markets, and we had this idea in Japan, and we said before that this would be used as somewhat of a blueprint going forward for other countries, and it certainly was. So after World War II, Japan does this, and now even later, these areas of Southeast Asia, some of them, not all of them, but take this idea of the state-aided market. So the state, the government, intervenes strategically into the market as a strategy. Export-led economic development is something different, but also used is where a country or an economy would rely on producing things that would be used for export, shipping to other countries that they would buy and use, and then therefore spark economic development as well. So these two factors led to some rapid economic development in the region, largely. And so then comes economic downturn. So we have our highs and we have our lows. And so we have economic downturn, the IMF, and structural adjustment programs, which we all know, if you remember, not so good, at least for other countries. And this one's no different. So economic downturn, we have a lot of growth going, a lot of things are happening. And then we have this idea of crony capitalism, essentially hooking up your friends when you're in power with some money, some prestige, and what have you. Largely just helping your friends get rich is what's taking place. Your friends or family, whatever. Obviously, we're oversimplifying it, but I think that's good. I think largely for our purposes, it's important to know. Crony capitalism actually led. So we had a lot of investors taking place. So we had a little bit of a relaxation on finances and things in this country, and we had some investors from around the world come in, and they're investing billions and billions of US dollars into the 90s. And then this crony capitalism takes place, and then we see that people really can't trust this economic development. It's not a sure bet anymore. It's not really a good investment, because we just see this money, the rich getting richer, and their friends, and their family, and things. So that leads to an economic downturn. The International Monetary Fund intervenes, but what do before they bail them out completely? They say you have to do some belt tightening measures, and you have to do some structural adjustment, and that largely leads to the states, the countries, doing some cost cutting through some social programs, which is not good for the people, and we know that, and that happens, seemingly happens everywhere and all the time, which is unfortunate, but certainly a little bit of a thing of the past. But so we have that taking place in the region. Then the impact of China's growth in Southeast Asia is also a little important. Well, it's not more than a little important. It's important. But the impact of China's growth. So China, as we know, a growing economy. It's geopolitical and economic growth in the last 30 years, give or take, is quite profound. And it's a place for cheap labor. And therefore, but just like anywhere, the people catch up and they demand higher wages and things like that, and greater conditions. And so therefore, it moves, Southeast Asia uses itself for a comparative advantage, and offers itself as a place for cheap labor, being not too far from China. And so Southeast Asia competes with China for cheap labor, and uses this somewhat of a model. So the book talks about two things here: feminization of labor and EPZs, so economic protection zones. So let's start here. I guess we start processing zones rather. So talk about workers' protections, but this whole separate thing. But we're going to mention that too. But getting ahead of myself. So between 80 and 90% of all workers in these export processing zones are women. That's that feminization of labor, largely because young single women are perceived to be least expensive and least troublesome as employees. Seen here is a Nike factory. And the book talks about some of the horrors of the working conditions that people have to face in Nike factories, being told that they have to work extra amount of time every day, every week, not getting paid for it, produce more goods. They settle in court for like $1 million. Everybody gets like $222. And there's even more factories going on, so that's kind of a shame that that's what happens. But working conditions are often quite poor. Salaries are quite small. Not new information to us, unfortunately. These EPZs are created in areas that are to spark, again, this idea of state intervention strategically, where there's little to no taxes at all, and they can aid the economy in the way that the government sees fit through these EPZs. So the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, this acronym is seen here. So during the 1980s and 90s, largely, Southeast Asian nations were trading with wealthier nations, trading with the West and China, outsiders, more so than they were trading with themselves, just nearby. And so this is the idea. We have the European Union, we have the African Union, we have CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement, and so the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, originates in 1967, originally as this anti-communist, anti-China association. But it pushes beyond that, and it goes much further now, and it does have partners in the region that aren't members of the organization or association, but are relatively considered allies, like Japan, South Korea, the United States to an extent, Australia, and others. And so today, this organization or association focuses on trade among members. Unlike the European Union, remember when the European Union, we had this idea of a social cohesion, where they would try to take disparity in terms of economics away and try to create a region that had a baseline of prosperity. Not the priority of this organization. We see a lot of economic volatility in the region, and they just sort of let that take place. And there isn't this financial transparency like we see also in the European Union. But a work in progress, perhaps. We'll see what the future has to hold. Power in politics. I am jumping too quick. So here we are, authoritarian tendencies. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but here we are, thinking out loud. So Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, the longest serving prime minister in the world's history, his son now in power, he discusses that the people, that basically that Asians are not able to, because of their attachment to Confucianism, are not able to think like Westerners in the sense that because of their ideology of Confucianism, that they're loyal to authority and that they're submissive. And so therefore this idea of democracy and rebellion just simply shouldn't be taking place. So kind of an authoritarian tendency, if you will, and that takes place in the entire region. So military coup d'etat in Thailand in 2014 was the 12th one since 1932. And it's actually funny because the book says that this is one of the more stable countries politically in the region, which I think is pretty funny actually, because well, it's not funny. I mean, it's funny, but I mean, it's also quite sad in a way. But it's sad for the people, obviously, that have to deal with this. But I think that's quite amazing that after the 12th coup, overthrow of the government in just a few decades, is considered one of the most stable in the region. And so that has something to say there. However, there's a challenging authority in Burma. Aung San Suu Kyi, seen here, a leader in Burma, and she's a leader in Burma as of 2016. She is placed on house arrest for 15 years. She gets out of house arrest in 2010, where she accepts her Nobel Peace Prize from 1991. I'm getting ahead of myself. I actually plan on talking about her totally when we talk about Burma, but here we are, a bit of a spoiler alert. So this idea of challenging authority in Burma took place with the successes of Aung San Suu Kyi. So other countries in the region are still controlled by authoritarian regimes or strongmen. There's a sultanate in Brunei and some relatively repressive leaders elsewhere. So this authoritarian tendency takes place. But we know that the world is just on a pursuit toward democracy, as we've seen around the world. And if we see that in that framework, then yes, there's this progress being made. But in all cases, there's not that same pursuit to democracy as we would perceive. So the politics of the fragmented. And the book then does a little bit of a discussion on Indonesia specifically here. So the fragmentation and diversity of Indonesia makes governing a challenge, well, no doubt. 17,000 islands, 3,000 are inhabited. Before the colonial era, this island chain, this archipelago of Indonesia was not considered a one nation. We know a nation, usually a large group of people. It was not considered that in itself. However, Sukarno comes along after World War II and has a political ideology of Pancasila, and he inside idea of relative loyalty and creation together as a discussion of harmony and belief in God and being tolerant. And so this idea is a way to unite the people of Indonesia because they are quite different in terms of their religion and ethnicity and the islands that they inhabit and their, being rural or urban and all the things that come with, living across 17,000 islands. However, in 1965, Suharto ousts Sukarno in a coup d'etat, supported by the United States, because Suharto was this anti-communist guy that comes along, so he's backed by all those players that think communism is still the scariest thing in the world, so they help oust him in 1965. However, there's a positive story, there's a bit of a positive ending to this. The national elections in 2004, and since then, while we see that the democracy is fragile, that they've had national elections since then, and so there has been success that's come of things. Urbanization. So here we are. Globalization and urbanization. Farmers are emigrating to city after abandoning small-scale farming. This is not new information. We talked about this several times before. We even talked about it in the last presentation. So they're giving up their farming and they're emigrating to cities. We call this push and pull forces. They're literally being pushed out of farming because it's not economically viable work, and they're being pulled to the city for jobs, for better jobs or different jobs. And so these push and pull factors. There are a whole lot of other ones that we could talk about in terms of push and pull migration, but largely what's taking place when we talk about farmers. So the region, Southeast Asia, is 47% urbanized, so roughly half the people live in an urban area in Southeast Asia. Labor-intensive manufacturing is still growing in some cities in the region. This is largely those factories, manufacturing industries, still growing due to cheap labor. And we talk about primate cities. Example here is Bangkok and Manila, Bangkok, Thailand, Manila, Philippines. These are primate cities, or cities that are way bigger than the next closest one. So this is a city that is the prime city, the main city in that area. So a primate city, Bangkok, Thailand, because Bangkok, Thailand is 20 times larger than the next closest sized city in Thailand. Manila is 10 times larger than the next closest large city in the Philippines. So these are primate cities and examples of those. And these are areas that are pooling in largely all of the people from rural areas. So low-priced labor. Migrants in Southeast Asia are a source for low or middle wage labor. 40% of foreign workers in Taiwan are Indonesian. You see here some Indonesians in Taiwan. Taiwan C, that is a typo. But nevertheless, we move on. Foreign workers in Asia or elsewhere. So the merchant marines in Southeast Asia, a group of seafarers that work on ships as cooks or cleaners and things like that. They're often paid their local wage back home. However, they're working these 6 months with little to no breaks, but they're saving up their money. So the merchant marines are a form of foreign work from Southeast Asianers. And the maid trade, as the book says. So these are domestic workers, often women, often on contracts, often working in rich areas in the rest of Asia and elsewhere. However, recent politician in Indonesia called them home. He says it's beneath the dignity of Indonesia or something like that to serve in that capacity. So nevertheless, foreign workers are a problem, but the countries of Southeast Asia recognize that losing this population is not exactly healthy, so doing their best for minimum wages and other enticements to bring them back and keep them home. Population and gender, moving along. Population dynamics, distinguishable variability throughout the region. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I'm scanning through these first. So basically what I mean by that is we could see that urban to rural, certain cities to others, there's really no cohesion in that sense that we saw like we did in parts of Europe, some regions in Europe. But most countries in the region have low birth rates and low death rates, and fertility rates are also lowering, and so trends in fertility rates and growth. So fertility rates are low, and we'll eventually see a population decline if you're just measuring fertility rate, because they're below replacement levels 2.1 in a lot of places. So below the replacement value of 2.1 in some countries here. However, 27% of the population in Southeast Asia are 15 years or younger. And so because we have a lot of people, nearly 30% of the population entering their reproductive years, that population will not be on a decline. It will continue to rise based on so many people being in their reproductive years. Population dynamics, population pyramids in Indonesia. You see that in the book. It's achieving that column. Right now we see a true pyramid or a true triangle where we have a lot of births and young people, and not a lot of people living into their elder years for a whole variety of reasons, as we all know really why. And if you see by 2050, that image is sort of achieving more of a column-like idea. We have more people in their middle or upper years. Certainly not a lot of people getting that 80s and 90s plus, but you can definitely see a column where the birth rates are slowed in the sense where it's homogeneous with the groups in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So achieving that column is, in a sense, achieving a new mark on the demographic transition model, and an idea of getting to that next level of security as a population. So here's just some ranking. The book spends like a page on ranking. Gross national income is high in Singapore and Brunei. Human Development Index, very high in Singapore and Brunei. So these are good ratings, although they're happening in the wealthiest two states in all of Southeast Asia, which is no surprise. Singapore, one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world per capita. Gender, high. So, for Thailand, Singapore, Brunei, and the Philippines. So this is actually better news because they're quite high in this regard for gendered issues, believe it or not. Sociocultural issues. Cultural and religious pluralism. So there's vast religious differences and cultural diversity, largely due to the histories of colonial remnants. I guess I'd want to say one thing going backwards. Back here, 6 countries have legislatures with more than the average women in the state. What am I saying? So we have 6 countries in our 11 here, for going back to this gender issue. 6 of them have legislatures with more than the world's average amount of women in their state legislature, which is 18%, which is actually sadly low. But we have 6 countries in Southeast Asia that have a higher percentage than that, and we have about 4 countries that have had women heads of states. So good and cool progress there. Back to this. You can see here what's going on here with Southeast Asia religions. Buddhism, largely coming from the rest of the mainland in terms of its influence, because of the influences of China, largely. You can see here Hinduism, largely influenced from South Asia, where it makes its way just into the northernmost part of this region, and one small place there. Some Chinese religions, a little bit ambiguous, but parts of areas that, again, come near China. And Islam, in most of Indonesia, traditional religions in some of these other areas. Roman Catholicism in the Philippines, 83% Roman Catholic in the Philippines, largely due to the history of Spanish colonization. And so the political empowerment of women, where they're making these gains, I guess I could have said my talk about the gains that they made politically here in this spot, but in gender as well. So there's cultural diversity that takes place largely because how and when they were settled, whether it was settled by other Asian cultures or if it was by European colonization, like the French, the British, the Portuguese, or the Spanish. But nevertheless, has religious differences play a large role. And these religions borrow from each other, as the book tells us. Those that are Christian living next to Muslims have taken some ideas, the animist religions, borrowing, or Christians borrowing from some of those as well. And so just these religions sort of feed off of each other, and it's very fluid in a sense, where they're not very strict to their original teachings. The sex industry. HIV rates continue to rapidly increase in rural areas where conservative leaders ban education and prevention programs. So this is sex education and HIV, STI, STD prevention programs. So sex tourism, sexual entertainment industry serving primarily men, originating from wartime. So as you know, men have been coming to this region since World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and so this industry sort of has its origins from wartime. The sex tourism supports more than 2.2 million jobs. It's in the informal economy, of course. This is an illegal enterprise. However, it's not well enforced because many people see the amount of people that are employed in this that seek a livelihood due to this industry, and therefore it's not well enforced in terms of policing this, or at least not typically. And so that actually wraps up, ending on that note, wraps us up for part 2. So just Southeast Asia part 1, Southeast Asia part 2. We wrap up, and next up, sub-regions, so check that up next.